You are listening to a Sustainable World Radio podcast. Sustainable World Radio brings you in-depth interviews, news, and commentary about positive solutions to environmental challenges. Solutions that adhere to the permaculture ethics of earth care, people care, fair share. Are you interested in learning more about permaculture projects around the globe? How to plant a food forest? Restorative design or ethnobotany? Then stay tuned for Sustainable World Radio. I'm your host and producer, Jill Cloutier. My guest today is Peter McCoy. Peter is a self-taught mycologist, teacher, and lecturer. Peter is also an original co-founder of Radical Mycology, a grassroots organization and movement that teaches the skills needed to work with mushrooms and fungi for personal, societal, and ecological resilience. Author of the new book, Radical Mycology, Peter is also a community organizer, street medic, artist, and musician. Hi, Peter. Welcome to Sustainable World Radio.
Hi, Jill. Thanks for having me. Happy to be here.
Oh, good. I'm so glad you're here. And, I loved in the book where you said that fungi are absent from our awareness, yet are everywhere around us. Can you explain that to our listeners?
Definitely. Well, so fungi, the fungal kingdom, or Mycete, is the largest branch on the tree of life. I kind of say that with the caveat that, of course, we can't quite quantify the number of bacteria, but certainly in regards in relationship to plants and animals, fungi vastly outnumber the higher organisms or eukaryotes, things with more complex cells. So not only are they, in great quantity, but they have evolved over the eons to basically fill every niche and biome. They literally permeate every single plant. Even just a few years ago, it was conservatively said maybe 95%. Now they say 100% of plants are literally filled on the inside with what are known as endophytic fungi. So every time you see a plant, you're seeing essentially plant cells surrounding a skeleton of fungal tissue, what's known as mycelium. They fill all the soils, especially soils that haven't been heavily disturbed or fertilized, and they do a lot of work in the soil to maintain the soil health and all the things that come from that, such as plants and animals. They fill our bodies. They fill the bodies of many, many insects. Probably, I would say estimate, or I can't really estimate a number, but I would not be surprised if the vast majority of all animals have beneficial fungal partners living inside their body. Just like we know we have beneficial microbes and bacteria, certainly the more they research, the more they find that yeasts and other microfungi are incredibly significant to insect health and the success of, say, beetles, which are the largest order of insects. All beetles are filled with yeast that help them digest and perhaps provide protection and immune support and things like this. So they're all around us, performing incredible ecological roles. They are sort of the grand chemist of nature, is a way that one of my friends likes to put it, performing some of the most complex chemistry in the natural world, helping cycle all nutrients, which everything takes part in. Even the weather helps cycle nutrients, but fungi do some of the most complex chemistry in that cycling. So they are such cornerstone species to all the cycles of life, and again, so central and ever present. But the thing about them is that they're hidden. They're so subtle that most people don't see them or recognize that, and then we don't ever learn about them or hear about them in popular culture or even our education system. So they're just completely off the radar for most people, and that awareness is not there. So one of the things I always say, and I always like to point that out, that it's nobody's fault that they don't know anything about fungi or that they don't have an appreciation for them, because it's just, most people haven't been told. But it's never too late to change that, because it is such a fascinating topic and one that I think is so important.
Mm-hmm. And you wrote, I believe, is your book 700 pages? Do I have that right?
Yeah, I mean, if you count every page, it's just about 700.
And it's fascinating. And for anyone who is interested in the fungal kingdom or queendom, as you call it, or not interested, I guarantee after reading through this book, you will be interested. I hope we can get into a lot of the topics in the book today in this interview. So you started mentioning some of the critical roles that fungi fulfill in nature. Can you explain more of those to our listeners?
Well, I know that I'm biased, but also I think just have this Again, sort of this awareness and just understanding that, in my opinion, everything they do is critical. And again, you can say that about any component of an ecological web, but fungi are these, what are called keystone species. If they weren't there, a lot of things would fall apart or would not be possible. So some great examples, ones that are more familiar to people are the mycorrhizal fungi. These are fungi that live in the soil and they form symbiotic beneficial relationships with plant roots. And the simplistic sort of definition is that the plant provides photosynthesized sugars to the fungus, and the fungus provides nutrients and water, and basically exponentially increases the root surface area. It latches onto the root, forms sort of a connective structure, and through that structure, they exchange nutrients. But it's a lot more complex than that. Well, not only do 90 to 95% of plants in the world form mycorrhizal relationships or have the ability to, many of them can't even survive without them. Especially a lot of trees, a lot of woodland trees will not survive without their mycorrhizal partners. So even where tree plantations are grown, like where I live in the Northwest, they have to inoculate the trees with mycorrhizal fungi to support the plants. But beyond that, what's really fascinating is that there are some fungi that are what are known as generalists. They can connect many species, dozens of species of plants together and channel nutrients together and through those plants, and in many, many ways perform this critical role of essentially monitoring and distributing and managing the health of the forest and the nutrient flow to where it needs to go. And beyond even just nutrients, there's a lot of studies that have shown that, say, if one plant is getting attacked, then other plants that are connected through the network will sort of turn on the same defense mechanisms before they get attacked by, say, an insect. So somehow the fungus is communicating a signal to tell the other plants to be on alert, and that has incredible and immeasurable ecological effects where it's stimulating these plant defenses, which then affects the insects, which then goes on to affect the insect populations, etc. And then so there's we start at the soil, but then it ripples up and it transcends throughout the macro and micro flora. Another really fascinating role that I like to point out, and I make a point of it in the book, is this common misconception of the what we call parasitic fungi or pathogenic fungi. Most people, even if you take, and I've known a lot of people who've taken environmental studies or even got their like master's degree in environmental studies, and if they learn anything about fungi, it's usually just a small piece on these forest pathogens, and usually with an emphasis on the fact that many of these fungi grow, infect trees, and that's timber harvests. But really, if you look at so many of the roles that these fungi play and how they actually interact with plants, it's often plants that are either diseased, so they're sort of clearing out sickness in this way, or they come in when there's monocropping or an unnatural state that is not diverse, not complex, and in a long time scale, longer than humans tend to think in, they essentially clear out an unbalanced, unhealthy system and make space for transition, succession, new complex interactions to develop. Um, and they're sort of, I like to say, like they're the heavy-handed enforcers of complexity in nature. If complexity and diversity is not there, they will make it happen, and at the same time also clear out the sickness and the disease, and sort of selectively cull the individuals that aren't healthy, and obviously that serves in the long-term benefit. It looks bad for the one tree or the one plant or the one animal that's getting sick, but it serves the whole system in the long term. And then beyond that, just more simple things as food, as medicine. Many animals, it seems that they sort of self-medicate eating medicinal mushrooms. So bears and elephants and things seem to know that some of these medicinal mushrooms are good for them. And as more and more research comes out, these interactions are becoming increasingly apparent. Just another huge point that I always stress is that mycology is one of the youngest natural sciences and one of the most overlooked and most understudied, despite its vast importance. It's considered a neglected mega science where it's incredibly significant, but very few people are looking at it, and it's almost at risk of fading in the West. Um, and so that's why I encourage the citizen science to research it, to go out, because there's so much we don't know, and the more we find, the more fascinating it becomes.
You're saying that this is really a neglected area of science. Why are people not studying mycology as much as other branches of science, in your opinion?
Well, it is it's a big question that I don't have a good answer to, and it's one that really point out for people to consider. Why is it that so many cultures, not all cultures, a lot of traditional cultures, especially traditional cultures, have relationships with fungi, And even contemporarily in Brazil and Mexico and Asia, there's a lot of research going on. But in certain contemporary cultures, especially Western and North American, Western European cultures, we are so absent, and our fungi are so absent from not only our awareness, but even our studies and especially our environmental studies, which to me just blows my mind because fungi are, like I say, at the center of all ecological webs. So to not even understand or consider or discuss them is just, you're missing essentially the center of the puzzle. Um, why that is, I really cannot say, but I think it's something that really needs to be pointed out and emphasized and intentionally changed and addressed. And that's why I do the work that I do, and how that's what I've said for many years. Is it's the state of affairs is these institutions move slowly, and for some reason, mycology just hasn't been emphasized in the West. And but it is a thing that people can study. Most of the mycologists I know are self-taught, including myself, and that's usually how it has to be, especially if you're really fascinated and dedicated to it. And but again, it just I always like to think about how where do certain cultural trends come from? Why are certain things interesting and not? And it's just a big part of it comes from education and popular culture, and fungi are basically completely absent from both. And so that's and then on top of that, when they are represented, especially in the media or movies or something, it's often this very like, oh, they're gross or they're weird in this very negative way. When to me, they're incredibly fascinating. I think they're the great healers of the planet in so many ways. They provide some of the most potent medicine. They seem to do, you can talk about this form of sort of fungal intelligence, very different than animal intelligence, but they seem to be doing these really complex things that serve great benefit in a time scales and in ways that we can't quite comprehend as animals or as humans. So I think there's just so much to it. So then, and everybody I know that I ever teach, that ever learns about this on their own, it's overwhelming. You get bitten and you never want to turn back because it's so incredible. And then you have to ask yourself, why did I never hear about this? Why did I never learn about it? When you're in elementary school, you put a sunflower seed in a cup of soil and you learn how plants sprout, but you never learn anything about mycelium, which is just a fascinating thing to look at. Children love it. I teach children mushroom cultivation and things. All these things are interesting to anybody.
It's so true. And I remember as a kid, the only time I would hear about mushrooms is fairy tales.
Hmm.
It wasn't anything, I don't remember ever learning about them. So, and I think there's a lot of superstition. Some people just, like you said, they're just like, ooh, yuck. They're slimy and this and that. I think it's really taking the veil off them and educating the world about the importance of the fungal kingdom. And that's what you're doing. And it's great. It's time.
Yeah. And a big part that a big thing that came up for me in researching the book and something I weave throughout the whole thing is that mycology, thankfully, is becoming increasingly popular. I've watched it from when I was studying it as a teenager and I didn't know anybody. And, I was not really ostracized, but nobody I knew was interested at all in this topic, to now it's becoming increasingly, fascinating for folks. But what I like to point out is, while that is certainly wonderful, and it's a I think one of the next big leaps forward for humanity to engage with and form relationships with the fungal kingdom, it's not a new aspect of the human story. Many cultures around the world in very complex and interesting ways have had pretty reverential relationships with fungi throughout time. It's really only recently, and again, mostly in contemporary Western cultures, where we've sort of lost that. But there is a rich history there. There is a lot of foundation and some tradition, and now we're backing a lot of that up, of course, with better science and a deeper understanding of the ecological significance, and then also just the cultivation, the practical interactions humans can have, and all these sort of applications of working with fungi.
And so, to get into more of the details about fungi, I'm just curious if you could share with our listeners what are some of the unique characteristics that members of the fungi kingdom have, and what makes something a member of that kingdom?
Yeah, well, that's a great question. Yeah, some people, don't really know what. Sometimes I say I study fungi, and they don't even know what word fungi means. So, fungi are distinguished from plants and animals, well, and bacteria. They just sort of a nitty gritty definition is they have larger, complex cells, what are known as eukaryotic cells. They have a defined nucleus, which distinguishes them from bacteria. They respirate like we do, as animals do. So they breathe in oxygen and expel CO2. They do not photosynthesize, but unlike animals, they do not digest internally. They digest externally through the release of enzymes and acids. They break down their food in their environment, and then they absorb and metabolize the byproducts of that external digestion. So that distinguishes them from animals. They have a unique sterol in their cell wall. So it's very similar to cholesterol, but it's called ergosterol, and it's unique to fungi. Those are sort of the definitions of what distinguishes a fungus from plants and animals and bacteria. But just more broadly, what are fungi and what forms do they come in that we can sort of consider? There are anywhere from conservatively 1.5 million to perhaps as many as 6.1 million, sort of on the
Wow.
currently potentially accepted extreme number of species in the world. We've only named and discovered less than 5% of those. But as it seems, as it currently stands, only a few hundred form or in the form of yeast, so single-celled yeast like we use for beer and bread and related forms. Some are also microscopic. These are known as chytrids, and there's different types of chytrids. These are aquatic, typically aquatic dwelling fungi. But the vast majority form what is known as mycelium. It's a network of tissue that interacts and grows and does so many things that is very unique compared to plants or animals. Some of that mycelium just stays as mycelium pretty much, and that's often takes the form of a mold. That mycelium can interact with plant cells to form lichens, or the mycelium of other fungi will coalesce and form a dense three-dimensional structure that we call mushrooms. But even a mushroom is really just condensed mycelium. It's not different tissue, not a different organ. So it's all about mycelium, mycelium, mycelium. I have a chapter in the book called "The Mycelium is the Message," because the mycelium is this incredible, it really is what the fungus is in so many ways, or what many fungi are. And it's the incredible unique roles and all these things that fungi do in the environment. It's because of the mycelial structure and also just the biology and physiology of mycelium. And that's what's really fascinating and unique. So just real briefly, a couple other things that I can say is that mycelium is a distributed network. So think of a really densely woven web, denser than anything we can manufacture. It's constantly bifurcating and splitting at the tips. So these edges and these the hyphal tips, as we call them, are constantly growing and sensing the environment and responding to the environment very dynamically in ways that we can't quite explain. And with clearly like chemical and light signals are influencing its direction and course. And as it's doing that, it's digesting and again releasing these nutrients, and which has huge ecological roles because it's providing food for many microbes, breaking down rocks, releasing rock minerals to the entire food web. And then along the way, what's really fascinating about mycelium is that it's not a chain of discrete cells like you might imagine if you zoomed in on your hand or in a plant or something. It's basically a giant open river system, if you will. Some species, a lot of my species have cross walls, but even those cross walls inside the mycelium have an opening or a little pore. And what that means is all the nutrients, all the nuclei, and all these things can move through the whole giant network, which can span hectares, can be
Wow.
huge. And it seems that that's a way that the fungus communicates with itself, relays information from the tips, and communicates in part or something, or at least is distributing these nutrients around and other things throughout this whole web, throughout the whole ecosystem to the mycorrhizal plants it associates with and on. So it's really, one of the things I talk about, and there's a chapter in the book where I talk a lot about the ecology of fungi, and I summarize that chapter by once you really, and this happened for me in researching, I thought I knew fungi, but when I really started to look into it and really started to wrap my head around all these connections and how it's mycelium touching mycelium and communicating in ways that seem to be based on non-chemical forms of communication that we can't quite detect, but it must be happening because they do things that would require something like that. There's this ultra structure to the environment that fungi are forming and slowly, I couldn't say perfecting, but because nature is always doing its thing, but they are everywhere. And when you start to understand what the mycelium is doing, that's what made me more of an ecologist, more of a naturalist, because you start to see it's all sort of these connections around you that fungi are helping form in these subtle hidden ways. Um, so one of the things I always talk about is, not only fungi are fascinating biologically, they're so unique, so unlike animals and plants, but in many ways, for me, they're like the greatest teachers of these patterns and principles of nature. They clearly embody a lot of the things that you may talk about in permaculture. I have a chapter where I talk about mycology in relationship to permaculture, and a lot of the permaculture principles, fungi purely and easily reflect, and so it's easy to use them as a model for these patterns that are found throughout nature, but fungi do them, 100%. So for me, they're the greatest thing and easiest thing to look to and model, not only our lifestyles after, but even whole societies.
Can you share with us a bit about permaculture principles and the patterns of nature and how the fungal kingdom really is doing this naturally and perfecting it almost?
I wouldn't want to use the word perfecting because we can never say what is nature's intention or what is evolution or they say there's no goal for evolution, but it's a constant refinement, constant retuning, increasing the harmonies and getting rid of the discordant tones. And fungi do that by bringing these beautiful assemblages into an environment. And I'm not making this up. There are, I mean, I have citations in the book where certain fungi, a great example are what are known as the ericoid fungi, mycorrhizal fungi. They form relationships with ericoid plants and they're ericaceae, excuse me. And these plants are often found in very harsh, highly acidic environments like tundras and heathlands and moorlands, peat bogs. And these fungi can survive incredibly acidic environments, and they enable their plants to survive these incredibly harsh environments. And it's actually they don't even really understand how the fungus can do that to some degree. But beyond that, these same mycorrhizal fungi that are channeling nutrients, as I've sort of described, and also protecting the health of the plant, they are also they are the primary decomposer. So the plant that they are supporting dies, falls over. That same fungus basically eats it and then channels that nutrients to other plants. It's really it's the driver and the whole manager of the entire ecosystem. I mean, that's huge. There's a whole paper called I forget the exact title, but basically Ericoid mycorrhizae, the drivers of these ecosystems. I forget the exact title, but that was coming across that paper was just like, okay, I'm not making this up. Other
Right.
scientists fully recognize this. And so, and then how I sort of put it is, just simplistically for people to wrap their head around, two of the major things that fungi do is they help ensure the nutrient cycling, successful nutrient cycling, and healthy succession and diversification of a habitat. Fungi do that in so many ways that I detail. So those are healthy like needs, I guess, in natural systems, or something you can see anywhere that there's diversity, you're often, especially good assemblages. But as far as how we can reflect on the mycelial growth, especially in terms of permaculture practices, say, which again, I have a whole chapter that's pretty heavily influenced and very clearly, explicitly influenced by permaculture. But a lot of the principles you talk about in permaculture, to be a good permaculturalist, I'm focusing here again on just cultivating fungi because that's a skill that is missing for most people's skill sets. And generally, an easy one is, well, actually taking a step back, what you have to think about too, and when I'm describing these, is basically putting yourself in the mindset of a mycelial network and thinking like a fungus, or embodying the mycelial mind is how I put it. And so we talk a lot about observing and interacting with the environment, learning from observation. It's critical to many aspects of life. That's how fungi, they are a clear embodiment of this principle of epigenetics, where they will change their genetic expression, or rather their enzymatic expression and things, based on what's in their environment. So they are directly responding to and observing and interacting with their environment, and then they respond sort of the best way based on what their environment requires, and that's how they stay healthy. That's how they've some of these species arguably haven't evolved in millions or billions of years. So they have it figured out in some sense. I won't get into all of them. I have like 15 of these principles in that chapter. But, working slowly and smallly and simply, fungi are subtle, and they do grow slowly, but they are constantly connecting and building bridges. And again, based on what's best for that habitat, not coming in with a sledgehammer, but really tuning in to what's needed there. And then also just similarly, usually a phrase in permaculture is integrate rather than segregate. I say myceliate rather than segregate. So again, just connecting the system, seeing how things flow together. This is nothing new for permaculturalists, but when you get to the section in the book, which is a bit later, hopefully the reader can understand where I'm coming from, because I first cover a lot of ground with what are fungi, what is their ecology, and how are they just so woven into our existence, yet we never realize that. And once you have that, then it's easy to again apply these principles. I'll just leave it there because there's 15 of them.
You also in your book talk about mycorrhizal symbiosis, and we've talked a bit about this today with certain plants, the fungus plant dynamic. And I was really surprised to see some of the crops, that grapes, citrus, melons, oak trees, Orchids, too, form a direct relationship with fungi and it helps them grow. Can you speak a bit about that? I know you've already said it, you may have already covered it, but it was just fascinating to read about these certain plants that we all eat and hold dear and then their relationship with the fungi.
Yeah, so they say again, conservatively, 90 to 95% of plants form mycorrhizal relationships. Some people say 85, so it's pretty high. There's certainly plants and whole families that do not form mycorrhizal relationships, like the brassicas or Brassicaceae. They're sort of outliers, but the vast majority do. They form these root fungal intersections. And the oldest plant fossil, the from roughly 450 million years ago, has this relationship. So it's basically been with plants since the beginning of plants arising on Earth. And it's very successful to plants for many reasons. And many plants have become so dependent on it that, again, they will not survive without their fungal partner. A really fascinating one, I think, for me is the orchids. So orchids are the largest group of flowering plants, supposedly the most quote unquote highly evolved plant, roughly 22, I think, to 25,000 species in the world. Every single orchid species is entirely dependent on its survival, at least initially, with dependent upon mycorrhizal fungi. These fungi help the seedling start. The orchid seeds have no nutrients. It depends on a mycorrhizal fungus to find it, basically intersect with it and provide it nutrients. And many orchids stay non-photosynthesizing for many years, or sometimes their whole life, because they're just getting all their nutrients from the fungus. What's fascinating really there, and I detail in the book, is that a single orchid root cell what happens is the fungus fills up the cell with what's called a peloton, a dense ball of mycelium, and within a day it will basically die back and leave that ball as a deposit inside the cell, and the orchid cell will digest that ball of mycelium for its nutrient source. So many orchids, that's their primary nutrient source. And with any of these plants, it's not just one fungus, one plant. There can be dozens, many fungi forming relationships at different roots, on different roots, throughout the whole plant, especially like a huge tree or something. But even with orchids, you can have multiple fungi, mycorrhizal fungi interacting with it. And one single orchid cell can basically be kept getting fed with successive waves of these pelotons by different fungi. They're just continuously feeding it throughout its whole life, which is incredible. And when you think about that, these are the most highly evolved plants, yet they're entirely dependent on fungi. What does that say about
Right.
evolution and the benefit of symbiosis? And this is to me a clear example that it's not survival of the fittest, but it's more survival of the most symbiotic, that is the most beneficial. And again, this is something that fungi teach very clearly.
Yes, and that was my next question was how can fungal biology and ecology influence the development of resilient systems and societies?
Well, again, I mean, I do have a chapter where I sort of get a little bit abstract with some of these concepts, but it's generally fungi. Again, these mycelial networks. It's all about the mycelium. People sometimes get really focused on the mushroom because that's the easiest thing to first interact with and eat and find in the woods, which is great. But when you get down to it, for me, it's so much about the mycelium, and these connections, right? But when you understand that and just sort of these principles, it's a very clear analogy or clear, model for concepts of systems theory and even like chaos theory, essentially how everything's connected, and that's just, most people can kind of get behind that. But when you wrap your head around, say, the more complex concepts of systems theory, that everything, the butterfly effect, everything affects everything over time, fungi show us that. So we have, course, the impacts of our actions, not only for now, but future generations. But then even beyond that, even in the here and now, how could we mimic our societies based on a mycelial network? And I think that would be one that's relatively horizontal, where nutrients and resources are well distributed, where there's a commons space where information can easily be exchanged without mediation or constraint, as opposed to, say, like technological mediation or corporate media mediation of information and ideas. So when there's more a mutual exchange and there's more liberty in that sense, I think that's when emergent cultures form, emergent ideas come out of natural interactions occurring between humans and their environment and fungi and everything else. But we don't have that. We have that less and less today in increasingly sort of segregated, individuated lifestyles, which is good to a certain extent. The individual needs their space, but also we're losing those commons, we're losing those connections in the communities. and fungi show us that that is not successful. That's not what nature does. And permaculturalists know this. A lot of people, naturalists know this. But again, the mycelium, if we need a model, mycelium is a great one.
What do you think of the internet as a model or is mimicking mycelium?
I mean, yeah, certainly it's the equalizer. I mean, it's obviously changed our life. It's changed my life. It's changed everybody's life in the last 10 years. And yeah, I mean that's undeniable. And it's certainly it's if you look at a map, sort of a theoretical model of the internet, it looks very much like a mycelium network. We can say the same about the distribution of dark matter and even how they think they model galaxies being distributed throughout the whole universe. But even down, if you want to take the idea of a net, the netted structure, I mean that is a great pattern of nature. I talk about it in the book as well. This concept, Taoist philosophy known as Li, and it's seen in the cracks of mud and in the in bone structure, in muscle fibers, in bark texture. So that netted, broken system or broken sort of net, that's a very common principle throughout the world, and it seems to be one that is just implicate to how nature forms. And so I think again, modeling that if we want to have lifestyles and technologies and things that are built off a reflection of nature, I think netting and connections and networks are a huge part of that.
And, one fascinating use of fungi is mycoremediation and using fungi to clean up environments that are toxic. Can you speak a bit about the importance of fungi in that role?
Certainly. Well, fungi, as the great chemists, like I said, my friend likes to say, um, they have this incredible and unique ability to degrade and naturally and sort of effortlessly decompose many complex and toxic compounds that would normally hurt and harm plants and animals. And then beyond that, most plants and animals can't even digest these things. So this gets into some toxic heavy metals. Fungi can help sort of mitigate their impact. But I think some of the most profound and unique things that fungi can do, because plants can accumulate heavy metals and they can be remediated in a way, fungi can break down and naturally degrade really complex and persistent chemicals. All the nasty things you ever hear about: petroleum products, fertilizers, pesticides, nerve gases. Many of these really complex compounds, which chemically have if you look at the chemical structure, they have often have a multi-ring structure, benzene rings, aromatic rings is they're often referred to. And simply put, those similar chemical structures are the chemical structure of the compounds are more or less, or sort of simply put, similar to the structure of lignin, which is the hard, woody compound that makes wood. Fungi are the only things that can break down lignin in nature. And so many decades ago, some scientist somewhere put it two and two together and say, hey, if fungi can break down lignin, I wonder if they can break down these similar compounds. And sure enough, they could. And over the decades, many tests have been done and shown, sure enough, fungi can break down all manner of compounds. Different species do it at different rates and with different, degrees of success. But it's a well accepted fact fungi are pretty good at breaking down chemicals. So how that translates out of the lab into our landscapes is a tricky question, because many of the protocols, or at least a lot of the information that's out there, has only been done in the lab. So now the challenge is scaling up and integrating that into a polluted environment in many ways that account for all the fungal biology and all their needs and so much stuff that you sort of, in my opinion, need to have a good understanding of before you just start sort of throwing spawn everywhere, which some people, wish would work, but doesn't, in my experience. And so something I've promoted for many years, and it's actually what is one of the main instigators, behind even started Radical Mycology a long time ago and writing the book, was in order for us to do good remediation work, which was my initial impetus many years ago, was getting better at that and teaching that. We have to be good at cultivating, and then to be good cultivators, we need to understand how fungi grow and what their ecology is. So hence the layers of the book. So, but as we stand now, there aren't very many field protocols. I outline sort of what I've worked on for many years to develop as best practices, and I put a lot of stuff together in unique ways that I think has never been available before. I even outlined whole new protocols that have never been publicly available in many ways, or readily available, I guess I should say, for remediating water, et cetera. And so now where I put it back into the hands of the reader. I say, rather than giving you sort of, backyard little like techniques you can do and sort of let's clean up a little bit of this, a little bit of that. I think what's the most beneficial to advancing this very important, very incredible, and vastly important field is people need to be like deeply knowledgeable about what they're doing and doing it well, and designing good experiments and stuff so that we can really progress the science because it's moving slowly, as science does, but a large part of that is because people don't quite know exactly what they're doing sometimes.
And so, if someone's listening and wants to become a backyard fungal farmer, that sounds like a good first step into the world of growing fungi in your backyard. And then you can maybe move on to bigger projects and cleaning up toxic messes around the world. But how easy is it to grow fungi in your backyard? And what are their needs? What do you need to provide them with to be successful?
Well, it is easy. It's so I always, one of the things I always also point out is that if you ever heard that growing mushrooms or fungi is difficult, um, it's not true. And you should get that idea out of your head because for much of the 20th century, that idea existed because the ideas and techniques that were promoted were very industrial techniques and very overly, well, very artificial, very unnatural, and very expensive because it's what the industry required, simply put. But to do it, our understanding has progressed so rapidly in the last century, which is only about as old as mushroom cultivation in a lab type of quality is. And so we've come a long way. And even in just the last decade or two with the internet, especially as the knowledge has gotten to be available in a way that it never was for the 20th century, and with so many people contributing and trying to advance simple, cheap DIY home scale mushroom growing, a lot of new techniques and practices have come out in just the last few years that have, it's constantly, the game is always changing. So never sell the science short and never give up on it because we don't know anything. I mean, we barely know anything at this point. So that being said, there's a lot of techniques for growing. There's a lot of protocols that exist and good books and some websites and things you can read. And we have stuff on the Radical Mycology site. But I think, again, going back to you can follow these protocols. But what I always saw lacking in the books I read and what took me so many years to wrap my head around and something I emphasize so much is that, yeah, you can follow protocols, but if you don't understand exactly why you're doing the things you're doing, you'll never master it. You'll just sort of be following somebody else's instruction, but never getting that intuitive flow. And so again, that goes into just understanding the fungi and their needs, which are pretty simple. They're like ours. They need water, food, warmth, a nice little place to live, and not be bothered too much. And how that generally plays out is we need to consider their diet. Different fungi eat different things. Some of them like fresh wood and a little bit of nitrogen in some forms. Other ones like compost or even more manure type stuff. So we have to match their ecological niche to what we feed them. Some of them are more wide spectrum and they'll eat anything. A great mushroom for that is the King Stropharia. It is the go-to backyard. Everybody should grow it if you want to grow a garden mushroom. It's known as a garden giant. It's an awesome mushroom. King Stropharia garden giant. So the food, you have to match that. Lots of water, but not too much. They need a lot of water, but you just can't get them all soaking and suffocating and drowning in however you set up their installation. Good shade so they don't dry out. Mushrooms, we grow them. Where do they grow? They grow in the shadier parts of the forest and things generally. So we want to make sure they're not baking in the sun. And generally we want to try to prevent competition. Usually we do that by giving them fresh food as opposed to old funky wood that has other fungi growing on it. And sort of, we can do an installation where we create a buffer, say with cardboard or something when we install it, just to give it a good foothold to establish itself. Once the fungus establishes itself, it has so many innate defense mechanisms, it can defend itself pretty well. But while it's initially getting established and sort of growing on the things, it's putting a lot of resources just into getting established. If it also has to fight off things at the same time, it's going to be juggling a bunch of stuff at once. So we want to limit those stressors and give it the best chance from the get-go. And once it gets established, again, most fungi do quite well, especially if they're, say, from your local environment and you're cultivating a local species or local strain that's adapted to the climate around you and it's not imported from across the country or something.
Mm-hmm. How can you tell if it's happy and growing well?
Well, it depends. What I was going to say is generally the mycelium is thick and ropey and just it's everywhere, but That being said, some fungi that's very true with the King Stropharia. It produces very thick, abundant, sweet smelling, happy looking mycelium if you get it going. But other fungi, their mycelium is very you don't really see it a lot, and you do an installation, say with like shaggy mane or something, which is a nice edible. You might install that near your compost pile, which is it's more of a compost type lover, just likes disturbed areas, and you don't really see the mycelium, but then suddenly you get a bunch of them across your yard, totally different area, and you've never had them on your property before, so it must have been what you had installed, but it just went where it wanted to go, and it does its own thing. And I mean, that's sort of a part of the game. Some species are more reliable, like King Stropharia, often stays in place, and it might travel, but it'll definitely usually fruit where you put it. Some will just travel around, but again, usually if the mycelium is present, that's what you're ideally looking for. Even a lot of species that we install in the ground, even if they don't have the thick, really ropey mycelium that Stropharia produces, say oysters or something, you can grow those in the ground. It's not their preferred habitat on wood chips or something. And even then, you'll see their mycelium. You dig through the chips or what have you, and you'll see it there.
Wow, that's so fascinating. And the book does include recipes for people that you can use the mushrooms that you grow in the recipes, and some of them sounded so good. The reishi ginger turmeric pale ale. You had chaga. I don't know if I'm saying that right.
Yeah.
Chaga latte. I mean, sounded really delicious. And when people are eating these mushrooms, they're actually ingesting a lot of protein and a lot of nutrients, right?
Yeah, I mean that's another huge thing that some people might not realize is that fungi are increasingly considered a very healthy whole food, and actually what's known as a functional food, meaning that they are not only nutritious but they're actually very medicinal at the same time. So you're getting a bunch of benefits. They are the only they're the only non-animal source of vitamin D, and they're the only non-animal source alongside tomatoes and some other Solanaceae that produces abundant umami, the fifth flavor, which is sort of the deep, rich, nourishing flavor. Fungi are, one of the few things that produces that. So they're great for culinary reasons in that sense, but they're often very high in trace minerals. Some fungi will accumulate many trace minerals, which are beneficial, and they accumulate them in a bioavailable form, as opposed to, say, supplements, which are often not bioavailable. They're low in fat, generally low in cholesterol, but high in fiber, high in protein. Some of them can be almost on par with meat, by dry weight. So they're an incredible food source, huge implications for food needs around the world. And on top of that, they can be grown off of almost any urban and agricultural waste. So they are this huge. They are fungi are the missing function from all of our systems, and they can be integrated in so many ways, close so many loops. They are the final loop. They are the loop closer in nature, and in so many living systems, and especially human designed living systems, they are, I think, the final missing piece. And again, it just always blows my mind, but it's understandable. Just you never see that presented, you never hear that discussed. Increasingly, that's changing, of course, but so many of the permaculture books, again, that I've read, like, that usually don't even mention fungi, and if it's due, it's very, very cursory. But for me, they fill so many holes. They support and they enhance and they refine and they just add another, again, function to these things. And the food component is a huge part of that. And that's growing your own is, again, a huge way to change the cultural dialogue around fungi, because not only, I think one of the holdups to people engaging with them is they're one of the most expensive things in the store.
Mm-hmm.
So most people can't afford them. Some people, of course, they've only had butt mushrooms, which in my opinion are some of the least tasty mushrooms. I met a lot of people who say, "Oh, I don't like mushrooms." And I say, "Well, which ones have you eaten?" They're like, "Oh, the ones at the salad bar." And I'm like, "Oh man,
The raw ones.
yeah." So, there's huge benefits to yeah, digesting them, growing them for yourself. Um, and then, last thing I'll say is you grow the mushrooms, say, on straw or some other agricultural waste that's abundant. You get the food, you get the medicine. That myceliated straw that the fungus is essentially fermented, you can then feed to animals, ruminants and non-ruminants. And it's study after study will show you that it increases their health. It's a viable protein source for animals. So, there's no waste coming out of this.
And medicinally, they're very powerful. They're so beneficial for the human system and natural systems as well.
One of the unique things about fungi is they produce Well, it's not quite unique because other plants produce these sugars, is what I'm getting at. One of those 1,4, or excuse me, 1,3 beta glucans, and some plants produce those, but in very small amounts, and it's often been bred out of plants. But anyway, fungi produce an abundance of these really complex, large sugars. There's many of them. I've never read a number. Perhaps they can't even number it because they can come in many shapes and sizes. But regardless, there are certain ones that have been identified, and from all the research, they seem to very much stimulate our innate immune system and basically boost our immune system and help us fight off diseases and basically be bounce back from so many radiation and chemotherapy treatments is one example, things that impact our immune system. And then beyond that, other compounds and extracts of fungi have been shown to have direct antiviral, antifungal, antibacterial properties, cholesterol reducing, blood pressure reducing, all the major ailments you can often think about with humans. There's a fungus out there that's been shown to alleviate it to some degree. Reishi, being this powerhouse, revered 10,000-year mushroom, was one of the nicknames or names given to it in Asia because it's one of the most revered and one of the top medicinal mushrooms, of all time.
And so, Peter, is there, well, one last question. We're getting low on our time, but the book is Radical Mycology. And is there a reason that you chose the word radical to include in the title of the book and in your organization?
Yeah, well, we started many years ago, and the initial impetus behind Radical Mycology was I was at the time, I mean, I've been fascinated by fungi for many years, never knew anybody else, and was increasingly getting more engaged with in social and environmental justice work, and just had these ideas floating around in my mind about how fungi can support these things and many of the things we talked about today. But it was very nebulous. And I was in college and I met a friend, Maya, who was the first person who not only shared my interest in fungi, but also did similar, volunteer work. So we kind of put these things together. We had this sort of socio-political analysis interwoven with mycology, and where like fungi can support all these social movements and things like that. And that was sort of where we initially came from. Now it's sort of transitioned to this thing where, radical, the word of it means to get to the root. And one of the things I say in the book is that, um, you know, often people are trying to find the underlying issue behind some sort of injustice in the world or something like that. And what mycology does is it not only helps you address some of these things at the foundation, with waste and pollution and making better systems and social designs and things that are more reflective of nature and holistic, but it also, when you get that mindset, you see how all those roots are connected to each other. And so it provides this sort of framework of, again, some of the things I've been talking about of, um, I've met many mycologists over the years who don't agree with incorporating politics, if you will, into mycology. They like to keep the science pure. But for me, you can't separate the two. Everything influences each other. And to have a robust analysis of anything, you have to consider all the influences, and how our society runs is a part of how science develops. And so, we're explicit about some of those social influences that affect the development of mycology. One of them being the fact that women are in the significant minority mycology. Perhaps I couldn't put a number to it, but compared to other sciences, women are in such a small minority. It's pretty sad. So just addressing these things as one example, but then also getting to, let's take our skills and our science and actually give this to the world. Mycology is so small; people are trying to often profit off of it in ways that really go against my personal ethics. And there's a lot of stuff I've seen over the years that are unfortunate in the mycological world. And I'm very much about making mycology open source, completely transforming the dialogue so that it's not a science and skill set of the few, but it's a skill set of the people, and something that everybody has access to because we all should, because they're everywhere around us. And so again, I can be explicit about my perspectives, my analysis, but at the end of the day, I don't, in the rest of us in the organization, we're not so much about the things that we're against, say, but how can we create the world that we want and create the culture that we want. And a big part of that is adding to culture by creating a new dialogue around fungi that's never been provided before. And also presenting all this cutting edge stuff with mycology. We're on the sort of the cutting edge. Mycology is constantly advancing. There's a lot of, again, metaphor there with the mycelial growth and things. And we like to mimic that in our structure. And again, just say we are humble humans not at the top of a food chain. We're incorporated into it. Fungi, forming the bubble of mycelium all around it. And how can we be not so anthropocentric, but more biocentric, and understand how we can shift our dialogues with fungi, but ultimately to our relationships with the natural world and to each other and things. So and that's a very uncommon discussion in the mycological world. Most mycologists and amateurs or professionals are pretty, about the science or just promoting certain aspects of mushroom cultivation or something. And we, myself and the other people in the collective, Radical Mycology Collective, aren't afraid to dip into some more taboo or sort of fringy topics because I think it's interesting and furthers dialogue. And there's so much we don't understand. There's so much that hasn't been said around fungi, especially that to limit ourselves is to limit culture.
Peter, where can people find your book? And we'd love to hear about your presence on the web and also your upcoming webinars and classes.
The book is currently available from the publishing house. The website for that is CHTHAEUS.com, catheus.com. We will get it onto Amazon shortly and working to get into bookstores and stuff. It's a slow process to do those types of things. But you can support the book and myself most directly by buying directly, and that's would be great. You can also check out radicalmycology.com. That's where I have a lot of workshops and courses that I present. Later this year, you can follow the blog or sign up for our email list or follow us on social media. I'll be doing a book tour around North America and be doing several cultivation courses along the way. Later this year, I'll be presenting whole new types of courses that I've never done before. So stay tuned. It's going to be some exciting stuff I'll be announcing.
That's fabulous. And, I loved also, I don't know if it was on your website or in your book where you talked about a vision of radical mycologists without borders, like traveling around. I love that idea.
I mean, I really think, whether it's an actual organization or, again, this idea, I mean, just like when permaculture started, right? It was this whole new idea. People were excited, but it took many years to develop. But eventually now it's spread around the world and people are promoting it and it's getting out there. And I think mycology is this incredible tool for the toolbox, but just most people don't even know it's in the hardware store. And as more people hear about that and hear that it's on sale, they're going to be going and picking it up and hopefully putting it to good use.
Is there anything that I didn't ask you that you want to share with listeners?
I guess I would just summarize by saying that, for anybody out there that maybe this is their first time hearing anything about fungi, if I sound like I'm completely off the wall or, this is just totally out of left field for you, I can appreciate that, but maybe give me a chance or something and look into these things because everything I say, I believe wholeheartedly. I've looked at this thoroughly. I'm a relatively critical person, or I like to think I balance ideas, and just for me, the why I've put so much energy and time into this book and into my work over the years is because I see this as this incredibly huge missing component of the current human story, and I think it's there's so many things in the world that could be addressed. This is what I'm adding to that dialogue because I feel compelled to do it, but also because it's inspiring because anybody can do it. And if you, as the listener, feel compelled or interested in these things, there's so much further we can't even imagine what the future of mycology looks like. And anybody can add to that. And it is this just an incredible time. And we're really only at the beginning of it too. I think some people think like, oh, we've already figured out all this cool stuff. I think we barely scratched the surface of potential. So I encourage anybody to at least start talking about fungi and destigmatizing them, and please never say that they're weird. They're kind of bizarre because they're super different, but they're not gross and they're not scary. They're really wonderful.
Well, thank you so much. It's been a pleasure to talk with you today.
Yeah, thank you so much, Jill. It's been great.
You've been listening to a Sustainable World Radio podcast. You can find us online at sustainableworldradio.com and also on iTunes. For more information about permaculture and ecology, visit the Sustainable World Media YouTube channel, where you'll find videos about permaculture, aquaponics, organic gardening, rainwater harvesting, and much, much more. Sustainable World Radio is a listener-supported program. If you like what we do, please consider making a donation to the show. I'm your host and producer, Jill Cloutier, and thank you so much for listening.